Right now, as you're watching this, the most important waterway on planet Earth is partially closed. Ships are being hit by drones, oil prices are spiking, and the President of the United States just gave a sovereign nation 48 hours to reopen a strait, or face total obliteration of its power grid. This isn't a movie. This is happening. And the scariest part? Most people still don't understand how we got here or what's really driving this. Today, we're going to fix that. I'm going to walk you through the entire hidden story. The covert operation that failed, the diplomacy that was never real, the ancient civilizations playing chess while Washington plays checkers, and the two paths the world is now staring down, one of which ends with a deal, and one of which ends somewhere no serious person wants to go. Stick with me because this story goes much deeper than anything you've seen in the headlines. Before a single bomb dropped, before a single satellite terminal was smuggled, before a single protest erupted, there was a currency, and a currency doesn't lie. In January 2025, $1 US would buy you around 700,000 Iranian rials. By the end of that same year, that same dollar bought you 1.42 million. That's not inflation, that's a free fall. And the consequences for ordinary Iranians were devastating in every sense of the word. According to reporting from Al Jazeera and multiple economic monitoring agencies, food prices had risen 72% year on year. Annual inflation was running at over 42%. The Iranian Ministry of Finance had reported that 7 million Iranians were going hungry in a country of 90 million people. Power outages were hitting 3 to 4 hours every single day. Meat had become a luxury that most families could no longer afford. The government's budget deficit had ballooned to numbers that economists were struggling to even put into words. This wasn't a temporary economic dip. This was a slow-motion collapse, and it was being felt in every household, every market stall, every kitchen table across the country. On December 28, 2025, the shopkeepers of Tehran's Grand Bazaar, one of the oldest and most significant markets in the world, shut their doors spontaneously. Not because someone told them to, not because a pamphlet was handed out, but because they simply couldn't take it anymore. That moment, that shutdown, lit a fuse, and someone, somewhere, was already holding the match. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and multiple intelligence analysts, a shadow network of Starlink satellite terminals had been pre-positioned across Iran, awaiting activation, potentially numbering in the tens of thousands. The Iranian E-commerce Association had estimated at least 30,000 active Starlink subscriptions, serving over 100,000 users inside the country before the protests even began. These terminals were smuggled in through a complex supply chain, partially enabled by a 2022 U.S. Treasury authorization, General License D2, which allowed American tech companies to provide connectivity tools directly to Iranian users, bypassing existing sanctions. The signals from Washington weren't exactly subtle. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who also ran the CIA, publicly posted on social media during the protests, "Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets." Israel's Mossad issued a statement declaring they were with Iranian protesters, and I'm quoting carefully here, not only from a distance and verbally, but in the field. These are not the statements of a government watching from afar. These are the fingerprints of an operation already in motion. The grievances of 90 million people were real, but the infrastructure surrounding those grievances, that was constructed, and it was constructed by professionals. January 8th, 2026, 8 p.m. Iran Standard Time. The Iranian government executed what digital rights organizations would later call the most advanced and severe internet blackout in the country's history. Within 30 minutes, Cloudflare recorded a 98.5% collapse in Iranian internet traffic. Terrestrial connectivity dropped below 2 to 3% of normal levels. The country went dark. But this wasn't just a simple ISP shutdown. According to researchers and security analysts, Iran had received Russian Kraska-4 jamming systems, truck-mounted broadband jammers capable of disrupting satellite communications across a range of 150 to 300 kilometers. They had also deployed the Murmansk BN long-range electronic warfare system, capable of jamming communications up to 5,000 kilometers away. Russian and Chinese specialists reportedly assisted in deploying these systems specifically against Starlink. The Iranian government claimed to have identified and seized approximately 40,000 active Starlink terminal connections during the blackout. Here's what makes this extraordinary. In Ukraine in 2022, when Russia attempted to jam Starlink, SpaceX was able to push software patches within hours to counter the jamming. The terminals kept working. In Iran, the updates pushed to Starlink failed. The terminals went dark, and when they went dark, the operational infrastructure supporting outside coordination went with them. According to reporting from security researchers, Iranian intelligence, likely with Russian and Chinese technical assistance, was then able to identify individuals who had been cooperating with foreign intelligence services, moving to neutralize them in the days that followed. The most sophisticated covert communications network ever deployed using commercial satellite technology, built by the world's richest man, had been neutralized by a country whose currency had just lost 73% of its value. That is not a small intelligence failure. That is a historic one. In the days immediately preceding what was supposed to be the U.S. strike window in early January, something happened on the Turkish-Syrian border that almost nobody covered. and yet it may have been the single most decisive event in the entire early phase of this conflict. Iranian and Turkish intelligence services cooperated to neutralize approximately 400 Kurdish fighters who had been attempting to move from Syria into Iran. 400 fighters gone in a coordinated joint operation between two countries that have been rivals and sometimes outright enemies for over 1,000 years. The reason this matters is brutal in its logic. The operational plan for destabilizing Iran had almost certainly counted on cross-border Kurdish militia activity to open a second front inside the country. Kurdish opposition groups, including the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, had already called for a general strike inside Iran. The fighters moving through Syria were almost certainly intended to support that pressure from within. Turkey shut it down, not to help the United States, not to help Israel, but because Ankara made a cold, hard calculation that a destabilized Iran is a catastrophic outcome for Turkish strategic interests. Here's the context that most Western analysts consistently miss. Iran and Turkey are what some historians call civilizational states. Entities with continuous cultural and political identities stretching back more than 1,000 years. The Persian Empire has been a continuous civilizational entity for roughly 2,600 years. Turkey emerged from Central Asia and has its own millennium-deep institutional memory. Neither of these states is going to help Washington or Tel Aviv fracture the other, because they both understand, on a deep historical level, that the next target could be themselves. When the Kurdish crossing was eliminated, when the Starlink network went dark, and when the protests began subsiding rather than escalating, the internal American military assessment almost certainly shifted. The premise that Iran was about to implode, that minimal external pressure would be sufficient, was no longer operative. The Revolutionary Guard was intact. The air defense network was intact. And at that point, the calculation changed entirely. June 22nd, 2025. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers departed from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. They flew east for 18 continuous hours, refueling mid-air 3 times, maintaining minimal communications. More than 125 aircraft in total. 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each one weighing 30,000 pounds, dropped on Iran's most sensitive nuclear facilities. Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from submarines. The targets, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The operation's codename was Midnight Hammer. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth declared Iran's nuclear ambitions obliterated. But here is the intelligence context that got almost no mainstream attention. In March 2025, before the bombs dropped, the U.S. intelligence community had formally assessed that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon and that Supreme Leader Khamenei had not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program he had suspended back in 2003. The IAEA Director General told CNN in a June 2025 interview that the agency did not have proof of a systemic effort by Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. A military strike was launched against a country that America's own intelligence apparatus said was not building the very weapon the strike was supposed to stop. That is a contradiction that the Arms Control Association formally documented in detailed analysis published just days before the second round of strikes. Starting in February 2026, the United States and Iran began a series of indirect nuclear negotiations in Geneva, mediated by Oman. 3 rounds of talks. And according to Oman's foreign minister, they were actually making progress. On February 26th, CBS News reported that Oman described the talks as yielding substantial progress toward a deal, with a senior Omani official saying a U.S.-Iran agreement was within our reach. Iran had reportedly agreed to degrade its enriched uranium stockpiles to the lowest level possible. A significant concession that, in any genuine negotiating environment, would have been the foundation for a framework deal. The following morning, according to Al Jazeera and a UN Security Council report, the United States launched what was dubbed Operation Epic Fury, more strikes, bombs falling while negotiators were still mid-discussion. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated afterward that the United States had betrayed diplomacy mid-negotiation. The experience, he said, made reaching any future agreement far more complex and complicated. The U.S. demands transmitted through Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had included a full stop on uranium enrichment, reductions in missile stockpiles, and cutting off support for all regional partners that Israel objected to, in exchange for sanctions relief. These were not negotiating positions designed to produce a deal. They were terms designed to produce a rejection. And that rejection gave way to what we're living through right now. On February 28, 2026, within hours of the latest U.S.-Israeli strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began transmitting warnings via VHF radio to every vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. No ships would be permitted to pass. Ship tracking data showed a 70% reduction in traffic almost immediately. By March 2nd, a senior IRGC official confirmed on record, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Should anyone attempt to pass, the brave members of the Revolutionary Guard and the regular Navy will ignite those vessels. And they weren't bluffing. At least 8 vessels were struck by drones. A U.S.-flagged ship was hit twice at the port of Bahrain. A Malta-flagged vessel's crew had to evacuate. Maritime traffic collapsed by 80%. The economic implications are staggering in scope. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply and 22% of global natural gas transits through this strait. China sources roughly 30% of its oil through the Persian Gulf. India, Japan, South Korea, all critically dependent on these shipping lanes. By March 3rd, the Trump administration had received word from energy executives that they refused to risk their assets or personnel navigating tankers through the strait until the kinetic nature of the conflict significantly decreased. The Pentagon and National Security Council, according to CNN reporting, had significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to actually pull this trigger. Now, as of this week, Trump has issued a 48-hour ultimatum threatening to obliterate Iran's power plants if Tehran doesn't reopen the strait. Iran's newly elevated supreme leader has publicly stated the strait will remain closed as a tool of pressure. This is the economic pressure point at the center of everything, and it's already hitting you. In your gas prices, your energy bills, and the global supply chains that keep goods on shelves. Path 1 is what you might call the narrow gate. There is a scenario in which Oman, Qatar, Turkey, and potentially China collectively push both Washington and Tehran toward a diplomatic off-ramp. This would require the United States to walk back its demand for full denuclearization as a precondition and return to something resembling the JCPOA framework, or at minimum, a temporary freeze and verify model. It would require Iran to accept meaningful constraints on its enrichment program in exchange for verifiable, phased sanctions relief. And it would require the current Israeli government to accept a deal rather than a war, which, given Israel's domestic political situation, is not a small ask. The diplomatic infrastructure hasn't been entirely destroyed. Oman's mediation channels remain active. The IAEA framework technically still exists. And both countries have, at various points in the last 12 months, signaled they would prefer a deal. The problem is that neither side has shown a genuine willingness to accept the compromises that deal would require. As of this week, satellite imagery shows Iran actively fortifying and re-excavating underground chambers at the Isfahan nuclear complex, reportedly attempting to recover stockpiles of highly enriched uranium that could potentially be used for multiple nuclear devices. That is not the behavior of a country preparing to negotiate. Path 2 is the spiral. Iran retaliates against American bases in the region. Missile strikes have already hit Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. The strait remains blocked or contested. Oil markets remain in shock. Houthi forces in Yemen resume full-scale Red Sea attacks on commercial shipping. Iranian-backed forces in Iraq begin targeting U.S. personnel. Israel faces sustained missile and drone bombardment. The United States escalates. Russia formally increases military assistance to Iran. China begins quietly shielding Iranian oil exports through third-party arrangements. The conflict becomes what military planners call a gray zone war. Neither a declared world war nor a contained regional skirmish, but a slow, grinding, enormously expensive confrontation that bleeds all parties and destabilizes the global economy for years. And then there's the dimension that makes serious analysts genuinely uncomfortable to discuss openly. Israel is estimated to possess between 250 and 300 nuclear warheads, deliverable by ballistic missiles, F-15s, F-35s, and by Dolphin-class submarines that Germany gifted to Israel, and that were subsequently modified to carry cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. Turkish President Erdogan has publicly acknowledged awareness of Israel's nuclear capabilities. Pakistan has reportedly maintained for decades a commitment to provide Turkey with a nuclear weapon if one were ever needed. The conventional logic that says use a nuclear weapon and the war ends, the Hiroshima model, does not apply in a region where Iran has 90 million people, where Turkey has its own deterrent arrangements, where Russia has publicly drawn hard lines, and where China has critical oil supply interests running directly through the combat zone. The use of a nuclear weapon in this context would almost certainly produce exactly the opposite of what its users intended. It would not end the war, it would expand it, in ways that no current war game is adequately modeling. Here's the part that makes all of this even harder to watch for anyone who's been paying attention for the last 2 decades. Venezuela didn't work. Cuba, after 60 years of sanctions, didn't work. Iraq didn't work. Afghanistan didn't work. The pattern is relentlessly, brutally consistent. You can destroy a government's infrastructure without destroying its will to reconstitute. You can collapse a population's economy without destroying their willingness to blame foreign powers rather than their own leadership. History, not ideology, just history, says that regime change happens when the military turns on its own leadership. That has not happened in Iran. Not in 2009 during the Green Movement, not in 2019 during the gasoline protests, not in 2022 after the death of Mahsa Amini, not in 2025, not now. The Revolutionary Guard and the broader security apparatus have held, they are holding. Meanwhile, the nuclear knowledge that Midnight Hammer and Epic Fury were supposedly designed to eliminate, the weaponization pathways, the scientific expertise, the institutional memory that Iran acquired before 2003, cannot be bombed away. Military strikes set back physical infrastructure. They do not set back knowledge. You can destroy the buildings. You cannot destroy the memory of how to rebuild them. Satellite imagery from February 2026 confirms what analysts warned. Iran is already fortifying new underground complexes, re-excavating sealed tunnel systems, and recovering enriched uranium stockpiles. The Arms Control Association has formally documented that the country may now be closer to nuclear weapons capability than it was before the strikes began. The strikes that were supposed to set Iran's nuclear program back by years may have accelerated the political will to actually build one. The real constraint on American ambition in this story might ultimately not be military capability. It might be fiscal reality. Bond markets, commercial real estate exposure, private debt, the structural limits of borrowing indefinitely. These are the ledgers that don't bend to political rhetoric. And right now, they're telling a different story than the press briefings. None of this is abstract. The Strait of Hormuz is not a foreign policy talking point. It is the pipe through which the global economy breathes. When that pipe is kinked, you feel it. Oil prices spike, heating bills climb, supply chains tighten, goods that depend on energy to manufacture and ship quietly get more expensive. China, which sources 30% of its oil through the Persian Gulf, has already condemned the US-Israeli strikes. Russia, which has spent years building economic ties with Iran through BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative, has called the latest operation a deliberate, premeditated, and unprovoked act of armed aggression against a sovereign UN member state. These are not diplomatic statements issued for show. These are countries with direct, concrete economic skin in the game. As of this week, March 2026, Iran is developing what Lloyd's List reports as a vetting system for Strait of Hormuz transit, potentially allowing ships from non-hostile nations through a safe corridor approved by the IRGC. Turkish ships have already been permitted passage. Indian and Saudi vessels have been allowed through. This is Iran using the strait not as a permanent blockade, but as a pressure lever. Selectively applied, strategically managed. That's not the behavior of a country in its final death throes. That's the behavior of a country playing a long game. And the question every serious analyst is now asking is not whether Iran survives this. It's what Iran looks like on the other side of it, and whether anyone who pushed this confrontation has any coherent answer for what comes after. 3 questions that should keep you up at night. Did the Trump administration genuinely exhaust diplomatic options before striking? Or was this, as the Arms Control Association has formally argued, a war of choice? Is Netanyahu protecting Israel, or gambling with it? And when the dust finally settles, which country comes out stronger? Which order comes out more stable? And was any of it, worth what it's already cost? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the only questions that matter now. The story is not over. It's barely begun. Stay locked in. Because at the pace this is moving, the next development is already on its way.